Alright, picture this. It's August 2025, and over 50 Democratic lawmakers from Texas have just pulled off what might be the most audacious political maneuver in recent memory. They've fled their home state, crossed state lines, and are now hiding out in hotels across Illinois and other blue states. Why? To stop President Trump and Texas Republicans from redrawing congressional maps that could hand the GOP up to 5 more seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. It sounds like something out of a political thriller, but this is real life, and here's the kicker. This isn't even the first time Texas Democrats have done this. In fact, it's becoming something of a Texas tradition. But to understand why politicians are literally running away from their jobs, we need to talk about something with a ridiculous name and a serious impact on American democracy: gerrymandering. And the story of gerrymandering? Well, it goes back over 200 years to a salamander, a grumpy governor, and one very creative newspaper editor. Let's rewind to 1812. The United States is still figuring itself out, and in Massachusetts, things are getting messy. Governor Elbridge Gerry, pronounced with a hard G like Gary, not Jerry, finds himself in a pickle. His Democratic-Republican Party is worried about losing power to the Federalists, so they come up with a plan. They'll redraw the voting districts to pack all the Federalist voters into just a few areas while spreading their own supporters across many more districts. Gerry doesn't love the idea. In fact, he finds it highly disagreeable. But political pressure wins out, and on February 11th, 1812, he signs the bill anyway. Now here's where things get interesting. A few weeks later, in the offices of the Boston Gazette, some Federalist newspaper editors are staring at the map of the newly drawn districts. One district in Essex County is particularly bizarre. It snakes around in this weird, contorted shape that stretches from Chelsea all the way up to the New Hampshire border. Enter Elkanah Tisdale, a local artist who happens to be hanging around the newspaper office. He looks at this weird district and starts doodling on the map, adding claws, wings, and a dragon-like head. There, he says, that will do for a salamander. Benjamin Russell, the newspaper's editor and a fierce Federalist, looks at the drawing and has a light bulb moment. Better say a gerrymander, he quips, combining Gerry's name with salamander. And just like that, on March 26, 1812, the Boston Gazette publishes what might be America's first viral political cartoon. The public was outraged, but Gerry's party kept control of the legislature thanks to those rigged districts. The monster had worked. For the first 150 years of American democracy, gerrymandering was basically a free-for-all. States could draw districts however they wanted. Some districts represented one guy, while others represented 20 people. No joke, the disparity was that extreme. There was no mandate that districts represented equal numbers of people, so politicians got creative in ways that would make today's map drawers blush. The system was especially abused in the Jim Crow South, where white politicians would pack black voters into one district to minimize their influence, then spread white voters across multiple districts to maximize theirs. This wasn't just about party politics, it was about racial control. Democrats in the South used gerrymandering to systematically reduce the power of black voters, who at the time primarily supported Republicans, the party of Lincoln and Reconstruction. This went on until 1962, when the Supreme Court finally said, okay, enough of this nonsense. In Baker v. Carr, they ruled that courts could actually review how districts were drawn. Until then, it was completely hands-off. States could do whatever they wanted. Then came the big one, Reynolds v. Sims in 1964. This established the famous one-person, one-vote principle. The court said that if you're going to redraw districts, which you should do at least every 10 years, each district has to represent roughly the same number of people. You can't have districts representing wildly different populations anymore. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 added another layer, saying the federal government could review maps in states with histories of racial discrimination. By 2013, the Supreme Court scaled that back, ruling that Mississippi wasn't necessarily more racist than Massachusetts these days, so the pre-clearance requirement wasn't needed anymore. The courts will step in to stop racial gerrymandering, but they've traditionally stayed away from political gerrymandering. If Massachusetts is 35% Republican, but all 9 of its congresspeople are Democrats, the courts have generally said that's a political problem, not a legal one. The whole gerrymandering debate is built on census data, those population counts that happen every 10 years. And it turns out the 2020 census was a disaster. In 2022, the Census Bureau admitted they had seriously messed up the count. Texas was undercounted by 560,000 people, and they only needed 189,000 more residents to gain another congressional seat. Florida was undercounted by 761,000 people when they only needed 171,500 people more to gain an extra seat. If the census had been done correctly, Trump might have won the 2024 election without winning Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, or Michigan. That's how badly the count was botched. Meanwhile, states like New York were overcounted by hundreds of thousands of people. Minnesota was overcounted by 216,971 residents, when they would have lost a congressional seat if the census had just counted 26 fewer people. Rhode Island was overcounted by 55,457 residents, when they would have lost their seat with a miscount of just 19,000. The pattern is striking. Most of the overcounted states were blue states, and most of the undercounted states were red states. The 2020 census essentially gave Democrats more congressional seats and electoral votes than they should have had, while shortchanging Republican states. But there's an even bigger constitutional question brewing. Should undocumented immigrants be counted in the census at all? This is where Trump's latest moves get interesting. The 14th Amendment says the census should count all persons, but it excludes Indians not taxed, meaning Native Americans who live on reservations and aren't subject to federal taxation. So the question becomes, are undocumented immigrants more like regular residents who should be counted, or more like Indians not taxed who shouldn't be? Trump argues that counting undocumented immigrants essentially rewards states like California and New York for harboring illegal immigration, giving them extra congressional seats based on people who can't vote and shouldn't be there. Democrats argue that the Constitution clearly says all persons, not all citizens. Currently, there are an estimated 18.6 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. If they're not counted, states with large undocumented populations, mostly blue states, would lose congressional seats and federal funding, while states with smaller undocumented populations, mostly red states, would gain representation. Let's be honest about something. Both parties gerrymander when they get the chance. The difference is largely one of opportunity and aggression. According to the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, which grades redistricting maps for fairness, plenty of blue states earn failing marks. Illinois Democrats have created what many consider one of the most aggressive gerrymanders in the country, giving their party a 14-3 advantage in a state that's much more competitive than those numbers suggest. Maryland Democrats historically ran one of the most notorious gerrymanders in the country, creating the bizarre 3rd congressional district that critics dubbed the praying mantis. Oregon and New Mexico Democrats have drawn maps designed to flip Republican seats. Even California, despite its independent redistricting commission, still sees Democratic governors making threats about retaliation. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, Republicans currently benefit from gerrymandering by about 16 House seats nationally, while Democrats gain about 8 to 10 seats from their own efforts. The Republican advantage comes from controlling more state legislatures and being more willing to break traditional norms. But here's the uncomfortable truth for Democrats currently fleeing Texas. While they're claiming to defend democracy, several blue state governors are openly discussing retaliatory gerrymandering. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, who's offering refuge to the fleeing Texas Democrats, told Stephen Colbert that eliminating more Republican seats in Illinois is, quote, on the table, and, quote, we've got to fight fire with fire. New York Governor Kathy Hochul has made similar threats, complaining about fighting this fight with one hand tied behind my back because of her state's independent redistricting commission. California's Gavin Newsom has also suggested the possibility of mid-decade redistricting to counter Republican moves.
As Texas Republicans renew their push to get congressional lines redrawn in their favor ahead of the 2026 midterms, Democrats are now moving forward with plans to offset any potential gains in California. California Democrats unveiling a new map that would strip Republicans of 5 of the 9 seats they currently hold in the deep blue state. State lawmakers plan to hold hearings and a vote to put the new maps on the ballot next week.
As this mid-decade showdown unfolds, California stands at a critical crossroads in the fight over fair representation. Governor Gavin Newsom has proposed the Election Rigging Response Act, a constitutional amendment that, if approved by voters in a November 4th, 2025 special election, would temporarily restore redistricting power to the state legislature to redraw 5 Republican-held U.S. House districts in a bid to counter GOP moves in Texas. While supporters frame it as a necessary defense of democracy, critics, including former Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, denounce it as a betrayal of California's hard-won independent redistricting commission. This moment underscores a paradox. In defending democracy, do we preserve institutions or risk undermining them? California's choice, and the choice of states watching, will shape not just its own political future, but the integrity of electoral systems across the nation.
We will affirm our commitment to the state independent redistricting after the 2030 census, but we're asking the voters for their consent to do midterm redistricting in 2026, 2028, and 2030 for the congressional maps to respond to what's happening in Texas, to respond what Trump is trying to excite.
So this all brings us back to Texas, which has turned both gerrymandering and dramatic political escapes into highly publicized art forms. The most famous example happened in 2003, when Republican House Majority Leader Tom DeLay decided to redraw Texas's congressional map mid-decade, something virtually unheard of in American politics to that point. Democratic House Leader Jim Dunham secretly chartered buses and convinced 51 House Democrats to flee to the Holiday Inn in Ardmore, Oklahoma. For nearly a week, they held up in that hotel, playing dominoes and doing interviews while state troopers back in Austin had orders to arrest them. The media dubbed them the Killer D's or Chicken D's, depending on your perspective. But political theater doesn't always translate to political success. A few months later, Republicans passed their redistricting plan anyway, flipping Texas's congressional delegation from 15 Republicans and 17 Democrats to 21 Republicans and 11 Democrats. In 2021, Texas Democrats tried again, this time fleeing to Washington, D.C. to block voting restriction bills. They chartered private jets, met with Vice President Kamala Harris, and generated massive media coverage. But just like in 2003, Republicans eventually passed their legislation when the Democrats came home. Now we're seeing the end of the trilogy, the sequel nobody asked for. When Trump called for Texas Republicans to redraw their maps to gain 5 more House seats, Democrats knew the playbook. Over 50 lawmakers scattered to blue states, hoping to delay the inevitable. But this time feels different. Republicans aren't just issuing arrest warrants, they're talking about FBI arrests and removing Democrats from office entirely. Attorney General Ken Paxton has threatened to, quote, hunt them down, while Governor Greg Abbott explores every legal avenue to force their return. The stakes are also higher. These aren't just Texas seats, they could determine control of the entire House of Representatives. If Texas successfully gains 5 Republican seats and Democratic governors retaliate by eliminating Republican seats in their own states, we could see an unprecedented escalation in partisan gerrymandering.
The California State Assembly just approved a change to the state's election maps that would likely net Democrats 5 seats in the U.S. House. This will lead to a special election in November where voters will approve changes to the maps. The vote today comes in response to redistricting efforts in Texas, where President Donald Trump asked Republican legislators to change the maps to help Republicans ahead of next year's midterm elections. With states like Maryland, Indiana, and Missouri now considering redistricting as well.
What's happening now represents something new and dangerous in American politics: the normalization of mid-decade redistricting. Traditionally, states only redrew their maps once per decade after the census. Breaking that norm was considered beyond the pale. But if Texas successfully redraws its maps, and Illinois responds by eliminating more Republican seats, and New York follows suit, and then California, and so on, we could enter an era where maps get redrawn whenever one party thinks it can gain an advantage. This would be catastrophic for Democratic stability. Right now, there are approximately 67 Republicans in Congress representing blue states, and 39 Democrats representing red states. If gerrymandering were taken to its ultimate extreme, red states making all their districts red and blue states making all their districts blue, it would radically shift the balance of power and create unprecedented political polarization. The fundamental issue is that gerrymandering is a bipartisan problem requiring a bipartisan solution. But both parties benefit from the practice when they control state governments, making reform incredibly difficult. California provides a model for how this could work. The state's Independent Redistricting Commission, created by voters in 2008, has produced maps that most experts consider fair. Democrats still hold most seats, but that reflects California's genuine Democratic lean, not gerrymandering. The commission process resulted in 0 lawsuits after 2020, almost unheard of in redistricting. But California's success required voters to take power away from their own politicians. something that's proven difficult to replicate elsewhere. Politicians, it turns out, really like choosing their own voters. Trump's push for a new census excluding undocumented immigrants adds another layer of complexity. This would fundamentally alter how representation works in America and likely faces massive legal challenge. But with a conservative Supreme Court that includes 3 Trump appointees, the outcome is far from certain. If Trump succeeds in excluding undocumented immigrants from the census count, it would shift congressional seats and electoral votes from blue states to red states on a scale not seen since the Civil War. Combined with aggressive gerrymandering, it could lock in Republican control of the House for the foreseeable future. Here's what's really at stake: the fundamental promise that voters choose their representatives, not the other way around. When politicians can manipulate census counts, redraw maps mid-decade, and face no consequences for breaking democratic norms, the entire system becomes corrupted. Both parties have contributed to this crisis. Republicans have been more aggressive and systematic, but Democrats gerrymander wherever they can and are now threatening massive retaliation rather than seeking reform. The result is an arms race where both sides keep escalating until democratic institutions collapse entirely. The Texas Democrats' flight is just the latest chapter in this dangerous story. They're simultaneously defending democracy and undermining it, fighting gerrymandering while their own party gerrymanders elsewhere, claiming moral authority while threatening to escalate the very practices they condemn. Back in 1812, Elbridge Gerry probably never imagined his reluctant signature would create a monster that would endure for centuries. The salamander has evolved, learned to adapt, and found willing hosts in both political parties. What's happening in Texas isn't just about one state or one election. It's about whether American democracy can survive when both parties decide that winning is more important than playing fair. The fleeing Democrats may delay the inevitable, but they can't stop the larger crisis engulfing our political system. The salamander isn't just alive, it's thriving, and it's learned that the best way to survive is to make sure both parties depend on it for power. As long as that remains true, we'll keep seeing more escapes, more threats, more broken norms, and fewer genuine choices for American voters. The only question now is whether we'll figure out how to slay that giant salamander monster before it devours what's left of our democracy. Thank you for watching The People's Press. Make sure to like and subscribe so you can stay up to date on our latest videos, weekly uploads every Friday.